Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's edition of Live and Ticking. My name is Claire Sand. I'm Director of Research Engagement at the BHF. And today we are going to be asking the very interesting question, can wearable devices improve my heart health? So wearables or fitness trackers, which you might wear on your wrist or on your clothing, are becoming more and more popular. I'm sure many of you either have one, engage with it a lot, or are curious about them. And with the development of this increasingly sophisticated technology, in general, wearable devices have become a really important part of how people track their health. So they can make tracking our activity more convenient and accurate. So instead of manually logging workouts or relying on estimates, we can use our wearable devices to automatically record and store our data. And we can also get information on our sleep, our heart health, all manner of things that previously we just didn't have access to without specialist intervention. So it's a really exciting, booming industry. And we are joined by two very special guests today. Mark Hamer, who is Professor of Sport and Exercise Medicine at UCL, University College London, who is using wearable devices in his global study involving 72,000 people to understand how activity levels, sitting time, sleep, etc., all the things that wearables can measure, influence our risk of getting heart and circulatory disease later on. So Mark is going to talk us through his study and how these wearable devices are helping us to capture information about physical behavior in a more accurate way than ever before. But before we hear from Mark, we have the great honor of hearing from Kevin McGovern-Ims, who was diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy after experiencing periods of high heart rate. And after being fitted with an ICD, Kevin has had to adjust the way that he exercises. He was just telling us about some of his activities, which I'm sure he'll share shortly, and now uses a fitness watch to track his heart rate and stay in shape while also making sure that he's confident that he's not pushing himself too hard and is exercising appropriately. So before we hear from Kevin, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of housekeeping points. If you have any questions for our speakers today, please submit them through the Q&A box throughout the talks. And if you see other people posing questions that you're interested in, you have the option to upvote them. We will also be joined by Senior Cardiac Nurse Cindy Jodar, who will be available to lend her expertise to answering some of the more clinical questions. And just as a reminder, as always, we'll try and answer as many of them as possible during the time that we have available. If we don't get to your question, please do feel free to call our heart helpline and speak to one of our expert cardiac nurses who will be happy to provide you with information and support. And I believe the team is now posting a link to our heart helpline in the chat box, so check that out. And you can also find on our website and in the chat box links to Health Unlocked, which is a sort of peer support community for people living with, affected by, adjacent to heart and circulatory conditions. So a great forum for connecting with people with similar experiences who want to share tips, share feelings. They encourage you all to get involved if that's relevant to you. And finally, I'm just going to leave you with a reminder that the BHF is 100% funded by you, the public. All of the research that you're going to hear about today, which is, pioneering the diagnostics and treatments of the future, is funded by the generosity of the British public. So if you feel inspired by what you hear today to give to the BHF to help power our mission in the future, whether that's big or small, we will appreciate all donations towards our life-saving research. And there's a link to donate as well in the box. So we're going to kick off, before I hand over to our speakers, with a quick poll question, which is, how would you rate your understanding of wearable devices and heart health? So we'll just take a second for people to have a little go at answering that question. So from 1 to 5, we've got a good spread of answers. And as the poll is running, I'm going to hand over to Kevin, who I am delighted to introduce you to today. So he's going to tell us a little bit about how he uses a wearable device to stay active and safe. And Kevin will be joined by the brilliant Rob Underwood from the BHF's Heart Stories team. So without further ado, welcome to Kevin and Rob.
Claire, thank you very much. And Kevin, first of all, let me echo that welcome. Thank you very much for sharing your story with us on this episode of Live and Ticking. Welcome along.
Good afternoon, Rob and Claire and everybody else participating today. You might have to turn me off because I have a tendency not to stop talking, according to my friends and family.
I'm sure we won't. I'm sure we won't.
Oh, I'm sure.
Listen, Kevin, as a fellow football fan, I'm keen to sort of find out your interest in that in just a moment. But I think for our viewers, first of all, it would be quite enlightening to find out more about yourself, where you're from, what you do, what are your interests, and what are your hobbies.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try and keep this down to a minimum. I'm 65 years young, on my second or third marriage, I can't remember which. Married to the beautiful Sharona. I live in North Worcestershire now, and I started off in Dundee 1959, and I have the north wind behind me constantly, which meant I had this sort of desire to travel and work. And when I joined the civil service, I joined HMRC in 77. I wanted a traveling job, and eventually I got one and ended up in Shropshire, having traveled and worked all around the UK and Ireland, and ended up as a project manager, senior project manager. And throughout my whole life, I've been very active in sport, walking, tennis, football, and have had a bit of a racy personality, but I didn't realize that perhaps the reason for that was a heart condition, which wasn't diagnosed until in my 50s, really. So I kind of carried it with me, but never really analysed it, and carried on until I think I realised that I needed to get it checked out, and it was around about 2010 when I was one of them days when you were just running around doing everything, and my heart rate went up to about 170, 180, and it wouldn't drop. So I thought I'd better get it checked out, and then I went along to the local A&E, which was actually literally local to me in Shropshire, and they took the car keys off me and said, "Right, you're in for the night." And then they discharged me about 24 hours later with some tablets and a series of appointments where after about 6 months of very detailed tests on my heart and my health, that's when hypertrophic cardiomyopathy was diagnosed.
Let me just stop you there then a second, yeah. Kevin. This must have been a real shock to you, as you mentioned there, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Can you remember what was going through your mind when you were told that?
It never had an impact on me at the time. I remember thinking, well, what does this mean to me? How do I need to change my lifestyle? Do I need to do things drastically? And I remember at the time thinking, he said, well, not really. I said, well, how does it affect me now? And he explained that your heart rate, your heart rhythm, your heart performance isn't your regular da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. It's more like, you know, the Bee Gees songs, which creates an energy in me. But he said it's because he thinks I was born with an additional muscle to my heart. So he says, your heart has probably learned to live with it. And it's grown, it's grown marginally, but it's grown as my heart's grown. So I remember at the time, he never actually said, Rob, change drastically what you're doing, because I carried on playing footy, which was five-a-side by then, climbing. I love to walk and climb, but it wasn't until later on, another sort of 5 years later, when I moved to Worcestershire. I carried on playing footy, and I kept commuting back to Shropshire, which was an hour and a quarter every Thursday night to play football. It was then when I fainted one game at football. That's when I realised something was up. And the next day I got it checked out. And it was at that point when I was advised to change the way I did things until until the heart specialist fully understood what was going on.
Talk to me some more then about that, Kevin. What was the treatment you had immediately after that?
Initially, medication, blood thinners, beta blocker, and eventually a statin. And then they discussed with me putting in an ICD. And they didn't initially put one in, but it eventually went in a couple of years later. I think it was 2014, 2018 it was fitted. But it was the advice then, adapt or die. He said, you can't carry on living your life the way you do. You need to slow it down and realize that your heart rate and your heart rhythm and your heart health will determine your life. So
how did that then affect your everyday life after that? You had this
it did actually hit me quite hard. I was about to book a around the world trip with my wife at the time, and we never did. I literally cancelled it and thought, well, that's the end of my life. I thought that's it. I might as well buy the pipe and slippers and become an old man. And but it was a very approachable cardiologist. So I had a chat with him about, well, is there anything I can do? Can I carry on doing this, carry on doing that? And I did my research as you do. You dive online and that. And he said, well, yeah, you can carry on sport, but you can't just throw yourself at it like you used to do before. And that's when I came across walking football as an activity in Worcestershire. And I sort of reached out to my local walking football group, and that's when I started to realize I can actually carry on playing walking football, carry on doing something without damaging my actual heart health.
It's a very popular pastime, isn't it, walking football now? So tell me, at what stage did you decide to start monitoring your exercise and using a sort of a device to do that?
Well, it was just after Rob, because I was being a data analyst. That was my trade, an analyst. I wanted to know what was going on with my heart, and I had my phone, and you can get details from your phone through the Apple system about heart rhythm, heart rate, and so on. And I had a monitor under my bed that the cardiologist provided to me because it was capturing data all the time from this ICD. But it wasn't, they weren't replaying it back to me. And I wanted to know because I started fainting again. And I thought, well, what's going on with my body? Why am I fainting? And nobody could explain to me at the time why I was fainting. And I wanted to know what I was doing when I was fainting and what I was feeling like. And in a way to try and understand what was going on. And so Sharon, my wife, suggested that I invest in an Apple Watch where I could wear. And that perhaps could capture more detailed data when, whilst I was living. And so I got really interested through that, Rob, through looking at the iWatch on a daily basis, what was going on with my heart rate whilst I was doing things.
How useful has that been? And I know, just throwing a quick funny story for us, while you were, because you're now a qualified ref, you're very much involved in your walking football. Just throwing a little funny story that you mentioned to me before about, I think your mum contacted you on it while you were playing.
Well, yeah. Well, so I'm using the watch, and it's got some great apps on it, as everybody knows, and I use it as a stopwatch, as well as managing my heart rate during the game. So I'm refereeing the game, and I'm using it as a stopwatch, and I'm keeping an eye on my heart rate. And then obviously it's a watch. It links up to my mobile phone, and then my mum rings me during the game. I'm thinking, oh no, what do I do now? Because my mum's 91, bless her, and so I had to kill the call, obviously, because that wouldn't have looked really professional enough during the game. So it was just an indicator to me that there's perhaps too much going on with your devices, and you perhaps need to mute some of them before you maybe doing certain activities.
Kevin, tell us briefly and finally, what advice would you give to somebody then who's in a similar position to yourself and who's looking to or considering getting a fitness device to monitor as you did?
Well, I would dive into it because I started off with a Fitbit, like, the little slim ones on your wrist, and it was really helpful at the time, but I was recommended a Garmin, which is a more sophisticated watch, but it's very chunky, and I went for an iWatch because it's very easy to read the data, and you can either read it on your iWatch or open your phone, and it'll give you an expanded view of the data that you're perhaps interested in, Rob, and it's permanent and it's historical, and it gives you trends as well. So you can have a basic tracker, a basic heart rate tracker, or if you want to look deeper and mine it into more detailed analysis, it can give you that as well. And that gives me the confidence to actually do more and more, Rob, because I know what my parameters are now, what I'm actually operating at in terms of health. You know, if I go beyond a certain parameter, I start to feel a little bit nauseous.
Well,
so it's that, Rob. It's the confidence it gives you to manage your heart health.
you're a great advert for it. I'm sure we're going to have more information shortly and a few more questions. Very, very briefly and finally, a quick message to those thinking about walking football who are afraid they might run accidentally.
It's, you've got to put your feet out and you walk with your heels, not your toes. If you put your toes down, you'll start to jog. So if you can think about that, and it's not easy to think about it while you're playing, but and pass the ball. Stop thinking about dribbling. That's the key. Passing and walking. And if you could focus on them two, you'll really start to enjoy it.
Well, Kevin, listen, it's great to get a snapshot of your story. Thanks so much for that. Really appreciate it. And with that, Claire, it's back to you.
Thank you so much, both of you, especially Kevin, for sharing your story. Really inspiring stuff. I'm sure you will have motivated a lot of us to get active and take an interest in the data that we're generating as we are moving our bodies. And to tell us a little bit more about how that looks on a sort of mass scale, our next speaker is Professor Mark Hamer, who is going to share how he is using wearable devices in his research to generate insights that could inform the way that we think about cardiovascular disease in the future. So over to you, Mark, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Claire, and it's a pleasure to come and speak this afternoon. Whilst I just get my slides sorted out, just a quick background to myself. As you've heard, I'm a professor at UCL, and I lead a research group in physical activity and population health. I started in this space back in the early 90s. I did a degree in sport and exercise science, and I suppose back then most of us thought that doing that degree we would be able to work with elite athletes and elite sports teams, but unfortunately that was obviously not the case, because those sorts of jobs were few and far between back then. So the discipline sort of had to change, and we ended up starting to look at the effects of exercise on health and how we could use exercise to both prevent and treat chronic disease. And that's really the space that I've ended up in for most of my career. I'm particularly interested in physical activity and heart disease, hence my link to BHF. So in the next quarter now, I'm just going to sort of start off by talking a little bit about what wearables are for people that aren't very familiar with the term. I'm then going to talk about how we are currently using wearables in some of our research, and then just finish on trying to answer the question that I was given, actually, can wearables actually make a difference? So this is a definition of what a wearable is. It's a device that can detect, analyze, and transmit information about vital signs. And in some cases, it will give some feedback to the wearer. So these were some of the sort of the early attempts at wearables. I think some were a bit more successful than others. So back in the 60s, the one on the left, I'm not quite sure what they were trying to measure there. It looks like it would be a pretty bad idea. So that obviously didn't take off. However, the one on the right is really interesting, because this was developed by a Japanese entrepreneur back in 1964, just before the Tokyo Olympics, and he called this the Mampo meter. And actually, today, if you translate that into today, this is actually a pedometer, and it measures steps. And Kevin's already mentioned steps. And I'm going to pick this up a bit later on, because this was actually a really important sort of invention to inform today's wearables. So fast forward to today, and Kevin's already mentioned some of the wearables that you can buy off the shelf. Some of you may own these or recognize them. I think probably the device that most people don't possibly realize is a wearable is in fact your smartphone, because nowadays most people carry their phones with them 24/7, and your phone is actually collecting data from you that you possibly don't realize. I'm going to talk about the sorts of devices that we use in research a bit later on, but the main difference between the devices that we use and the ones that you can buy are the research devices don't actually give any feedback, because we just simply want to measure. So just a few examples. I'm going to give you an example of quite a fancy wearable, and then I'm going to talk about the phone. This is a Pixel, Google Pixel. This is probably the main competition to the iWatch. And this device, you can see it's measuring loads of stuff. It's got some very fancy sensors on the back of the watch, which does all the fancy data collection. What I'm really interested in is the accelerometer, because that provides data on physical activity and sleep, and that's what I'm really going to focus on for most of the presentation today. Now, I mentioned your phone. If you do have an iPhone, you might have realized that or recognized this app. It's a kind of like a white background with a red heart, and that, if you click on that app sort of later on, you'll see that your phone is actually collecting your steps every day, your step count. And I'll show you later how that can be really interesting to track, and how it's actually quite important for your health. So I see wearables that can be used in 4 different ways, and I'm just going to sort of walk you through these. So the first thing, this is the most useful thing for you. It's to sort of track your physical activity, your heart rate, things that Kevin has already spoken about. And you do that with the types of devices that you can buy off the shelf. Now, the second area, which is very much still in development, is about diagnosis, clinical diagnosis. And at the moment, I would say this is very much in the early research stages. There's something, people aren't really using this clinically, but I think in another 5 years, it may be something that we are starting to use. So, for example, a paper came out a few months back where they've used wearables to detect early onset of Parkinson's. Something that's quite a bit of research has been done on detecting heart rhythms, which could possibly be predictive of future risk of heart attack. The third area is about monitoring, and so this is, for example, something that athletes can do to see how they've recovered from training. If you happen to be into cycling, you'll have heard of Whoop. That's the big thing that the cyclists use. Nowadays we can get wearables that will give us continuous data on blood glucose. So that's very helpful for diabetics. So there's lots of different uses for this. Now, the last quadrant is the thing that I'm most interested in. It's about how we use these wearables in observational cohorts. So these are very large population cohort studies where we give people devices, research grade devices, and we're interested in looking at how those patterns of movement are related to different health outcomes such as heart disease. And I'm going to talk about that a bit more. So traditionally in my area, we've used questionnaires to try and get at how much physical activity people are doing in their daily lives. And typically we ask things about structured sport and exercise, such as going to the gym, etc. Those types of approaches have a few problems. The first one being that most people actually find it quite difficult to accurately recall how much they've been doing. The second issue is that these questionnaires really only sort of pick up the tip of the iceberg, because when you start wearing wearables, you realize that the thing that people do most of during a 24-hour period is sleep and sit. And there's not much movement. And the movement that does happen is often done in sort of accumulated over everyday life. So in actual fact, those questionnaires aren't really giving us very much information. So what we've become really interested in is this sort of 24-hour cycle, and we're seeing it as a composition. And we're interested in kind of the optimal composition of that 24 hours for your health. On the right-hand side here, just a bit of an example of the type of data that we get from these research-grade wearables. And you can see we can really break this down into different parts of the day in terms of what people are doing. This is just looking at postural allocation over 6 hours of the day. So the research that BHF are currently funding us to do, we're about halfway through a 5-year project. And in essence, what we do is collect wearables data from large populations across the world. This study, which we've just finished, was actually consists of 6 cohorts, about 15,000 people. All of those people have contributed about a week's worth of wearables data for 24/7. And we've also collected some really important risk factors for heart disease, for example, cholesterol. We have a measure of something called glycated hemoglobin, which is a marker of diabetes. And we also take various measures of body composition. So the idea of this paper was to look at what is the optimal composition of 24-hour movement with the wearable for heart, some of these risk factors for heart health. And what we can do is kind of do this modeling exercise whereby if you were to theoretically replace half an hour of sitting with half an hour of moderate to vigorous activity, then we might predict that this would have a certain benefit on some of these risk factors. So, for example, if we did that for your body mass index, then we would predict a half an hour substitution per day of sitting with activity would result in around about half a unit reduction in body mass index. So a lot of people often ask me about step count. Step count is probably one of the most widely publicized public health messages in my field. And many of you will be aware of this kind of target of 10,000 steps a day. And up until recently, that didn't really have very much science behind it, and nobody knew where it had really come from. It possibly come from the Japanese inventor back in the 60s. We don't really know. But more recently, we've got some really good data on this, and this has been generated from studies that have put wearables onto people, and then they've followed those people over time to see which of them develop heart disease. And when you've got those sorts of data, you can do some fancy statistics, and you can sort of work out the optimal number of steps that you might need to accumulate to prevent heart disease. And this is a study that did that, and looking at the data, the 10,000 mark is it's not far off the mark, but it's probably a slight overestimate. So this study estimated that taking between 6,000 to 9,000 steps a day, you would reduce your risk of heart disease by around about 40 to 50%. So steps from a wearable are really, really important. Before I finish, I just want to sort of answer the main question is, do wearables actually really do anything, or are they just a bit of a gimmick? So in terms of the science, there's been a lot of studies that have looked at this. And this is a review that tried to pull all of those studies together. Around about 185 studies have have looked at whether a wearable actually has any effect on our daily steps. And when this sort of study is called a meta-analysis, and when we pull all the effects together, you see that on average, if you wear a wearable, then you're going to increase your steps by nearly 2,000 steps a day. And that's certainly very significant for your health. However, it's not quite enough to get up to your minimum sort of 6,000 that we're looking for. So I just wanted to finish on kind of sharing a few tips on, if you are looking to get a bit more physically active, what sort of things can you do alongside your wearable? So you can spend you can spend as little or as much as you want on a wearable, and you could spend £10 on a pedometer to give you steps. If you wanted to spend a bit more money or a lot more money, it would obviously give you a lot more data as well. But the key element of a wearable is the feedback. So we know that self-monitoring and feedback is a really crucial aspect to changing people's behaviour, particularly physical activity. We also know that if you do activity with your friends or family, that's also really important to help you sustain your activity. Goal setting is something that some of the wearables also do, and that's really important. And once you are starting to achieve your steps, then you can also start to think about how intense some of your activity is. And what we tend to recommend, particularly for heart health, is something in the sort of moderate intensity zone. And that's a sort of intensity that you should be getting a bit breathless, but you're still able to hold a conversation. So just to finish on, the 10,000 steps a day is not a bad ballpark to look at, but it's probably slightly less if you really want to get benefit. So I'm going to stop there, and just like to acknowledge the BHF for their very generous funding, and many of my colleagues that have contributed to this research as well. So yeah, thanks very much, Claire.
Thanks, Mark. Absolutely fascinating stuff. I'm sure you'll agree, and great to see how these wearables are facilitating insights and real-world research. We're going to move into the Q&A session now, and we have a few questions. I'm going to start with one for Kevin, which is, how do you know whether you're pushing yourself too hard during exercise? And has this ever happened to you?
Hi again. Yes. I switch it on as soon as I leave the house or as soon as I do things. So I've got this tracker on my iWatch, and I've got this optimum parameter of pace, if you like, in heart rate between sort of 70 and 90. And if I go above 90, I start to feel nausea and I feel uncomfortable, and it seems to have a knock-on effect when I get home, and it seems to stay with me sometimes for 2 or 3 hours, where I have to literally just lie down and reset my rhythms again. So by using the tracker, I'm sort of trying to maintain those parameters, and as a result of it, I know I can keep going a lot longer, and get more out of life.
Brill, thank you very much. The next question, I think maybe Cindy, is for you, although perhaps Mark, you've also got a view on this. How accurate are wearables at monitoring atrial fibrillation, and which devices actually work?
They are very helpful in monitoring any arrhythmia or irregular heartbeats. And there are some monitors available that basically it can detect any arrhythmias. But it's very important to bear in mind that these are not medical devices. So it might give you a prompt that you've got an irregular heartbeat, but it's not replacing the medical investigations. So if you get these messages and these warnings, it's advised to discuss it with your GP or the nurse looking after you, and they might decide to send you for further investigation, because these monitors are doing single lead ECGs, and if someone has got arrhythmia such as atrial fibrillation, they need to have a 12-lead ECG, which they do it at GP surgeries and in the hospitals. So they are helpful in some cases to pick the problem up, but they are not for diagnosing the problem. So you still need to ask for medical advice.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on to a question from Ian, who was wondering whether you can relate to this, Kevin. Ian says he started using an Apple Watch a couple of years ago, but cut back because looking at the data was making him a bit paranoid about drops in pulse and oxygen at night, and the ECG not being useful unless you have an arrhythmia. But he does find it to be useful to prompt a sort of shift and to not stay sedentary for too long. So is that something that you've ever encountered, Kevin, that you're sort of overloaded with the data and maybe start becoming paranoid about sort of random occurrences that you see?
Well, having an obsessive personality, I actually enjoy the detailed data, but I don't use it for sleep. Mark was talking about the data that you gather when you. I don't use my I don't wear it at night, so I don't really know what's going on with my rhythm. But I needed that level of assurance when I had the devices fitted. I needed that confidence, and it gave me that confidence that I could do things, and how far I could push myself. But also Cindy's right. If I had any questions about what was going on, I knew it wouldn't answer the questions. I had to reach out to the professional team and get more detailed stuff checked out. So I use it for not the basics, but I just use it for 2 or 3 aspects now. I love my steps, as Mark was saying. I like the range of heart rate and rhythms. And I'm also keen, I don't know whether I mentioned, I've now got a pacemaker. I'm keen to know when it kicks in. It's set for 40 beats per minute, I think. So I'm keen to analyze the data that I get on my iWatch, my iPhone, when that kicks in, and that's another aspect of it. So that when I go along annually to the cardiology team, I've actually got some data to share with them as well as them. So, but yeah, you can become obsessed with it, but I kind of switch off a lot of the time with the detail now, and I'm just comfortable with the minimum sort of the minimum data.
Thank you very much. One for Mark now. Of all the things that you can track with a wearable, what do you think is the most important indicator to track for health? Exercise, sitting time, or sleep? And actually, I'm going to sort of segue that into a second question, which is from someone who has said they keep hearing the phrase "sitting is the new smoking." Why is sitting so harmful? And what advice would you give to someone who wants to be more active? So maybe if we can start with the sort of variable that you think is the best indicator of health.
Yeah. So yeah, no, thanks for those 2 really important questions. So if you put my neck on the line, steps, I think, because I think step count is just something very easy to understand, and you can get into the intricacies of how much sort of vigorous, moderate exercise you'll be doing. But I think particularly if you're sort of fairly new to sort of exercising for selectivity and you just want to get going, then I think step count's brilliant because you've got some really easy targets to go for. In terms of the second question around sedentary time, there has indeed been lots of interest in sitting time. one of the reasons is that up until 10 years ago, we'd never used to measure sitting time because we just used to think that people that don't exercise are sedentary. But actually, you can get into this scenario where you can do quite a lot of exercise, but you can also do quite a lot of sitting. So people realised that the two things were probably not operating together. But I mean, the best advice for sitting, if you are physically active, then that is going to lessen the impact of sitting on your health. But if you're struggling to actually be physically active, then something we know is very beneficial is actually just breaking up prolonged sitting time. So, you know, if you know that you're going to be sitting at your desk for 8 hours at work, then just try and every hour, just try and break it up and make sure you move. That's probably the best advice at the minute.
Can just sort of, could you expand a little bit on what is it about sitting that is so unhealthy? Is it just lack of movement, or is it sitting specifically that's harmful?
Yeah, well, we know that, so that the muscle is a really important for health in many different ways. And when we move, we get the muscle, obviously the muscles start to work, and they produce lots of biological effects that are important for our health. So if we're not getting enough muscle contraction over the day, it's not producing enough of those really beneficial biological effects in our body. And that's what we believe is one of the sort of underlying reasons for why prolonged sitting is really bad for your health.
Great, thanks. Cindy, did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I'm quite happy with Mark's response. No, I've got nothing to add. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, so back to Kevin. I think you actually already touched on this, Kevin, but do you share the data from your Apple Watch with your cardiologist, and what kind of conversations do you have about it?
I did last year, yeah, because prior to, not so much now that I've got the pacemaker in, because I think that they eventually got the right treatment for what my underlying issues are. But prior to the pacemaker, I was still fainting, and I was sharing with them the data that I was collecting from my iWatch and Apple phone, until they put a recorder in me, which is another additional device that they wanted to capture what was happening with my heart rate when it was really slow. And it was that device that actually identified the underlying problem, I think, that I had at the time. And through the actual phone itself, I used the phone to submit the data that it was collecting. And within 24 hours, they'd contact me to say, right, we've got enough now. We're going to put a pacemaker in and eventually remove the ICD. And that's the new treatment for your underlying condition. So it wasn't initially my data that I shared with them, but it was the data through the recorder that I think hit the spot, really, provided the silver bullet, because we couldn't work out why I kept on fainting, really, and I was sharing the data that I had from my iWatch. But as Cindy said, it's only singular data, and they needed a bit more detailed data, which they gathered in through that recorder device, which is like the size of a USB stick that they put in. That was it. That was incredible. That how everything came together just within 3 or 4 months of that. So although that's not anything that you'd wear, and I don't think you can buy it and wear it, that device to me, I think, probably saved my life. That simple recorder, and it and the fact that I transmitted that data within minutes of me fainting, within an hour or two, I'd got a phone call to say, right, get your bag packed, we've got a bed for you, and 24 hours later, I was wearing a pacemaker, all from the data sharing.
Wow, nice to have the mystery solved.
Yeah, it was. It was a relief, because the last time it happened, I was driving at the time, and yeah, that could have ended up with another storyline. Yeah.
Yeah. Thankfully you're here today and
Yes. Yeah.
thriving and healthy.
Yeah. Well-ish. Yeah.
Going back to Mark, so in your studies where you're looking at the link between the variables that you're collecting and heart health, how do you know that, and you sort of suggested that the steps that people were taking, that wearing the wearables was increasing the number of steps and that was beneficial for heart health. How do you know that that's the wearable rather than just the people that you recruit to these studies are more likely to be interested in health, interested in physical activity, and care more about improving their heart health generally?
Yeah, that's a very good sciencey question actually, and that's something that we have to think about all the time. So there's a few different ways I'll answer that. The first thing that I didn't explain is that the cohorts that we use are largely what we call general population cohorts. So the one that I've been very heavily involved is the 1970 British cohort study, which was obviously started in 1970 when with people that were born, babies that were born then. And we've been following those participants across their lives. So those participants were never recruited for a wearable study. They're a general population representative of the population. However, there is an issue of confounding. So, in other words, the people that tend to be more physically active are also people that have generally better lifestyles. So, you know, they don't smoke, they don't drink very much, they tend to have better diets. They tend to come from better, less deprived backgrounds, those sorts of things. So we have to be very careful to statistically take those factors out of the equation when we're looking at links between physical activity generated from wearables and some of these health outcomes. But yeah, it's a very good question. Yeah.
Thanks. That's really helpful to understand. Kevin, have you ever received any alerts or notifications from your watch about your heart?
Yes. As you know, there's one of the alerts on there. Is it a collision monitor that if I was to fall over or make a sudden movement, it would come up and tell me, ask me, are you okay? Do you want me to ring 999 and stuff like that? That's really useful. And I think Cindy mentioned AFib. I do have AFib. That's come up a few times, asking me to check it out. So I've gone onto my phone and had a little look at it and had a little look at some deeper analysis. So yes, yeah, it has. I've got both alerts switched on, so they're active, you know. So, but I've got a good relationship with a team in Worcester, so if I wouldn't just, you know, come to any conclusions myself. I'd rather go back to the cardiology team and say, well, what do you think's going on? Do you need to see me, etc.?
Great. I think this is a question maybe for all three of you, which I think a lot of us can relate to. This person has said, I have a desk job, which means I'm sat down for a lot of the day. And I know it's not good for me, but it's tied to my income. Do you know of any tactics or methods to break up long periods of sitting during the day? And Mark, I think you already touched on that, but I don't know whether anyone wants to jump in with some practical tips or tricks for how to break up long periods of sitting.
Well, I do my steps. You know, when Mark was saying about, I realised I have a desk job as well. In fact, I've got 3 part-time jobs now that I'm retired. And one of them is a gatekeeper in the public school I work at, and I'm analysing CCTV. So I'm sat there analysing this CCTV, but I've worked out I can actually get my steps in if I stand up and literally just march on the spot. And it sort of energises me or re-energises me. I look a bit of a plonker, I guess, people seeing it, especially walking past the gatehouse, but I don't care anymore. I'm just feeling healthier as a result of getting those steps in, because I could literally waste hours not doing anything if I didn't do that. Whereas once I start marching and getting the steps in, it actually has a reinvigorating effect on me mentally as well as physically. So I do that, and I feel better.
Great tip. Mark, Cindy, anything to add?
I'm just going to echo what Kevin said. You can have a reminder for yourself that after being sitting for like 60 to 90 minutes, just have a wander around 5 minutes. And then because we all do desk jobs, and sometimes you get so much involved in your job and that you forget about yourself, that you have to change the position and move around. So normally I just set a reminder for myself to just basically do a 5 minutes walk around. So that's another way of also achieving that. So I don't know whether Mark want to add anything.
Yeah, I was just going to add a few things about how you can try and use your environment a bit. And this may or may not be applicable to the person that answered the question, but standing desks are really good. So that might depend on whether your employer is willing to get you a standing desk, because we know that standing is better than sitting, prolonged sitting. Second thing, I don't know if you're home-based or if you're actually in an office, but if there's an opportunity to use the stairs instead of the lift, then you can accumulate some really good exercise simply climbing short bursts of 2-3 minutes of exercise climbing stairs. If you do that every day, that's going to be very good. You can also think about active commuting to and from the office. Again, this may not be achievable, but even if it's just a case of trying to walk, getting some walking during your commute to the office, again, it's a really good way of trying to just break up that sitting or diminish the harmful effects of that sitting over the day.
Great, thanks, guys. Some really good, helpful hints there. Just a sort of follow-on question, really, in the chat, which is if you've spent years sort of working in an office where you haven't necessarily been conscious of breaking it up, can you reverse damage done by now walking 10,000 steps a day?
There's some really good evidence that basically it's never too late to start. You can definitely reverse harmful effects, and exercise is very potent in cardiac rehab. So if you have been in a fortunate situation to have a heart attack, one of the most important things to do is to get onto an exercise cardiac rehab program, because you can do some amazing things to rejuvenate the arteries, lipid profiles, blood pressure. So it's absolutely never too late to start. No.
Good to know. Another question, probably for you, Mark. I've heard that doing all your exercise in one go, like going to the gym for an hour, isn't as good as being active throughout the day. Is this true, and why?
Yeah, there's been some really interesting work on this called the Weekend Warriors. So we've actually done some work on this. We look at people that basically accumulate all of their exercise in 1 or 2 days of the week, which we term Weekend Warrior, compared to people that accumulate little bits on every day across the whole week. And actually there's no difference. So if you match people for total exercise volume, that you see the same benefits. So that's what the science suggests. Yeah. So if unfortunately if you can only get it all in on 1 or 2 days of the week, it's still going to be really beneficial to do that.
Good to know. And actually, sort of related to that, are exercise bikes and walking machines or treadmills as the equivalent to actually walking?
Yes, I think if I understand the question correctly, is exercising sort of in a gym environment the same as doing
I guess using a
walking
machine like the
outside?
treadmill. So is walking on a treadmill the same as walking on the road?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the only kind of difference could be in terms of the sort of mental health benefits. You know, there is some evidence to suggest that, you know, if you're outside in a nice environment, that there could be some mental health benefits. But in terms of the fundamental cardiovascular health benefits, it's the same. It's the same.
Great, thank you very much. And another one for you, Mark. Have you ever done studies like these without using wearable devices, sorry, and how does the data compare?
Yes, so before we had wearables, about 10 years ago, we were using questionnaires to measure physical activity. And what's quite interesting is you tend to find that the questionnaire data underestimates the actual true effect. So when you've got the wearables, because you're getting at those data much more a detailed fashion, yeah, you actually see that physical activity is probably a lot more powerful than we had originally thought when we were collecting those data rather crudely with those questionnaires.
Great, thank you very much. So I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. If your question wasn't answered, please do feel free to get in touch with the expert cardiac nurses on our heart helpline, who will be able to give you some more information and support. We really appreciate you being here with us today. A particular thank you to our speakers who've been absolutely brilliant and very inspiring. So thank you to Mark and Kevin and Cindy for helping answer some of those all-important questions, and to you, the audience, for giving us your attention. Before we wrap up, I'd like to ask a final poll question, which is the sort of follow-on from our first question. How would you rate your understanding of how wearable devices can improve heart health now? So we'd be very grateful if you could let us know. And a final message from me, as I say, all of the work of the BHF and the amazing research that we support, including that conducted by Mark, is made possible by you. So thank you for all of your generous contributions and support. And again, a reminder that if you would like to support us further and contribute towards our life-saving research, there is a link in the chat box. So just to finish by saying, Live and Ticking is our monthly webinar series, and we want to make sure it's as brilliant as possible and that you all get the most out of it that you can. So your feedback and comments are really crucial to help us plan and develop future events. So we would be very grateful if you could take the time to complete the short survey at the end of this event or through email. That will just help us improve the future event series. So if you want to refer back to the event that you saw today, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel next week. And as a reminder, our next event will take place on the 26th of June. And the topic for that one will be understanding sudden cardiac death. So please feel free to register using the link in the chat box. We would love to see as many of you as possible there. So thank you again for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and goodbye.